Hello and welcome to day 3 of your course. In this lesson, we're going to be covering energy systems. So the aims of this kind of session and what we hope to get out of this by the end is to be able to describe how carbohydrates, fats and proteins are used in the production of energy and what we call adenosine triphosphate, which we'll explain as we go along through these slides. We also want to be able to explain the use of the three energy systems during aerobic and anaerobic type activities. So, the first kind of question we want to look at is why does the body itself need energy? So, all I want you to do is take a couple of minutes. You can pause this video and just write down on a bit of notepaper what you think is the main kind of need for energy and how does the body actually use that and what is the purpose of it. So, I hope you've made some notes. Looking at the body and its needs for energy. The body needs energy in order to create any kind of movement, but also to produce any kind of force against opposing objects. It needs energy to generate heat, so in order to keep us warm in those colder days. To replicate cells and tissues within the body. So when our body is going through that kind of repair and recovery phase, it's going to need energy in order to do so. To support your neural functions. To maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis meaning balance within the body. And to live and function. So again, I've got another question for you. If petrol is the main source of fuel for a car, what is the main source of fuel needed for the body? And again, I want you to just take a couple of minutes on a bit of notepaper, just write down any potential answers. And again, pause this video and click play again when you're ready. So the question was obviously, if fuel is, like petrol for example, is fuel for a car, what is fuel for our body? And the answer to that is the food that we eat. So we consume food generally in three main food groups, carbohydrates being one of those. One thing I do want you to note is that a carbohydrate is 4 calories per gram of carbs that you consume. That does tend to pop up as a question in exams, so it might be worth just making a note of the calories per gram as we go through this. So carbohydrates are broken down into glycogen. They are then stored in the muscles and liver and also stored as excess fat. Protein, same as carbohydrates, is also 4 calories per gram. These are broken down into amino acids, and again, any excess is stored as fat within the body. And then fats itself, they are now 9 calories per gram. So looking at the numbers there, that would tell you that for every gram of fat you eat, you're almost consuming just over double the amount of calories that you are if you consume a gram of protein and a gram of carbs. And you can potentially look at that in 2 different ways. You can look at that and be like, whoa, actually that's really easy to overconsume fats and that's actually really bad for you because it's twice the amount of calories. You could also look at it on the opposite kind of side of things and be like, well, actually a calorie is a measurement of energy. So 9 calories per gram, that's giving me double the amount of energy per gram that I consume. Which is why we shouldn't always deem fats as a bad thing. As long as your body is consuming those calories, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So let's say you're about to go run a marathon. Normally what would happen is you would do what they call carbohydrate loading or carb loading the day before and on the morning. So you would eat a couple of bowls of pasta, stock up on carbs, ready for that race. So you've got a continued slow release energy throughout. What they now suggest is you should actually combine that with fats and do carbohydrate and fat loading, purely because fats give you twice the amount of energy. So when you're in that race, you're getting more per gram of energy from fats than you are carbohydrates. Yes, if you do this on a daily basis and you're just constantly overeating on fats and you're not using it, it's going to get stored around the body, around those vital organs. So it's just worth thinking, like, if you've got a client or even for yourself who is an endurance athlete and they need that energy for a race, it's worth recommending to load up on fat beforehand. So looking at energy sources, Energy comes from the breakdown of a chemical substance known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's key when it comes to energy systems, and we're going to keep referring back to ATP as we kind of progress through these. ATP is the energy currency of the body. So imagine you go to the shops and you need to purchase something. We exchange currency for that product. So we'll hand over some money, they give us the product in return. It's the same with the body, except the currency is this chemical called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So what we do is we say to the body, I'm about to perform an activity, I need X amount of energy. So the body goes, okay, well, that's going to cost you X amount of ATP. So the body basically needs to ensure that we have the correct amount of currency in order to purchase the amount of energy that we need. And the ways in which we do this we'll talk about as we progress through the slides. But it's worth noting that ATP is the only fuel the human body recognizes and uses, and without it, the body would cease to be alive. So what is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which basically means one adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates, tri in Latin meaning 3. So we have this one molecule with 3 phosphates, and just kind of try to envision this floating around the body. Imagine now those phosphates are held on by an elastic band that is being stretched. When you cut a stretched out elastic band, it releases the built up energy inside and will normally ping off in a direction. It's exactly the same here. So we get the energy from breaking off one of those phosphates and cutting that band. The moment it's cut, that energy is released, and we can now consume that in whatever it is that activity that we're performing. But once that one phosphate has been cut off, it's now known as adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2. The issue we now have is now it's become a diphosphate, and there's now 2 phosphates attached to it, not 3. The body can no longer recognize that. So it's almost like with 3 phosphates, it's like identification. So you're trying to get into a club, you show it, it sees the 3 phosphates, recognizes it, lets you in. When it becomes di, it's almost like there's a wrong photo on there and you get declined. So the body cannot recognize this as a source of energy with just 2. So what needs to happen is the body has to find another phosphate and link them back together to resynthesize it back into a triphosphate. And what we're going to do, and the purpose of teaching energy systems, is we're going to talk about 3 different ways in which the body finds that third phosphate and links them back together again. So before we go on to those 3 energy systems, there's just a little bit more information about ATP here. So we generally have limited stores of ATP within the body. Lasts 1 to 2 seconds, and once it's used, it has to be remade or resynthesized, as we just kind of briefly spoke about. Resynthesis of ATP comes from either the breakdown of what we call creatine phosphate, or we can use certain food groups and nutrients that we consume within the body to resynthesize it. So, what are the 3 systems? We have what we call the ATP-PC system. So ATP being adenosine triphosphate, and the PC stands for phosphocreatine. We also have the lactic system, or the lactate, and then we have the aerobic system. So these 3 systems are basically 3 different ways in which the body can get that third phosphate and link it back up again so we can recognize it as ATP to use for energy. So let's move on to the first one, your creatine phosphate system, and how the body uses this to find that third phosphate. This system utilizes creatine phosphate, and it's key to note this is a chemical energy to remake ATP almost instantly. Creatine phosphate supplies are in the muscles are naturally limited, so we do produce it naturally, and we can get it from foods that we eat, such as red meats. But like I say, we're basically consuming it in lower quantities. This particular energy system is very good at remaking ATP and utilizing it for rapid energy for short bursts. So something that is going to be almost max intensity. So something like a 100-meter sprint or a 1 rep max in the gym, your body will go to this particular energy system to find that phosphate because it can do it quickly. But like I say, it can't do it for a long period of time. So if the activity is very short but requires a lot of energy, it will go to your creatine phosphate. It's also key to note that this particular system doesn't require oxygen, fat, or carbohydrates. It's purely chemical energy using that creatine system, which means it doesn't produce any waste products. So this is why a lot of athletes and gym users will actually take creatine phosphate as a supplement. The reason being, all they're doing is by taking that as a supplement, they're filling their bodies with extra phosphates. So when the ADP goes searching for a phosphate, it goes, oh, look, well, there's one, because we naturally have them freely floating around because we've consumed it as a supplement. And yes, the body can produce small amounts naturally and we can get it from red meat, but sometimes for like elite athletes, it's more convenient to take it as a supplement. So what I'm going to show you now is just a quick animation. So here's your freely floating phosphate. It gets added to your ADP, and there you have it. You've now got your triphosphate back. So like I say, it's why the body will go to this one for a quick response, because we have phosphates just floating around. The body can just utilize those quickly. But like I say, it's only good for activities such as 100-meter sprint, javelin, shot put, a golf or a tennis swing, weightlifting, high jump. So something that requires a lot of energy, but for a very short period of time. So the duration there at the bottom says around 0 to 10 seconds worth of activity. The body will use that creatine phosphate system to find the phosphate because it can do it quickly. So what happens now if we're doing an activity that lasts longer than 10 seconds? The body will switch over and find the phosphate using the lactate system. So what this does now is uses stored glycogen to remake ATP. And glycogen is just carbohydrates that have been broken down and stored within the body. So this provides ATP when oxygen is not freely available within the cell. The issue with this one, and I say issue, but the waste product, should we say, is what we call lactic acid. And if you've trained in the gym before and you've been doing, X amount of reps and you start to feel what they call the burn and your muscles start to hurt, that is because lactic acid is building up, which means your body is actually using this lactate system to find that phosphate to give you the energy you need for the activity. This creates that burning sensation in the muscle. So what I want you to kind of try and envision in your head now is imagine if, so basically carbohydrates are sugars or pastas, like your simple or your starch-based rice. So imagine now you take loads of sugar, you put it into a saucepan and you put it boil on. That sugar is going to start bubbling and almost look like an acid. That's kind of how I want you to imagine this system works, is we've consumed carbohydrates, it's broken down into glycogen, and we're now using that to cook up energy and make this ATP. But the byproduct or waste product of that is this bubbling acid that kind of starts to cause the muscles to burn. So this means we have a limit. We're not going to be able to push through that burn forever. So this only really helps when we're doing activities that last, kind of 1 to 3 minutes. So that puts us at an intensity of around 60 to 95% of our maximum effort. But what this will do is this will cook up all the sugars, basically produce that phosphate to give you the energy. So again, I'm going to show you a little animation now. So here's your glycogen. This now gets broken down. So the carbohydrates have been broken down into glycogen and stored in the body. In order to break that down further, we cook up the glycogen and it breaks it down into glucose. The glucose then helps to produce your ATP. But as a waste product of that, we now produce that lactic acid, which is going to cause that burning sensation. So one thing to note, the word anaerobic, so this refers to the lactate and the creatine phosphate system. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So what activities is the lactate system good for? Maybe a 400-meter run now, a 100-meter swim, maybe a 200-meter swim, hurdles. So something that is still quite a high intensity, but you're not pushing at 100% max effort. So Now what happens if we want to go even longer? So now we're looking at like your full endurance activities, maybe like a marathon run, a triathlon, something like that. The body is going to switch into the oxygen or the aerobic system. So this particular system now uses the breakdown of carbohydrates, fat, and oxygen. So we have something called a mitochondria, and I will show you a picture of one in a second. But I want you to envision a mitochondria it's a cell in the body, but try and picture it as like a cooking pot or a cauldron. What we do is we put the carbohydrates in the little cooking pot, we'll throw some fats in there, we'll put a little bit of oxygen in, we'll mix it all together, and out of that comes your ATP. So we put that phosphate, we link everything back together. So it's almost like a little recipe we're putting in. Does produce a waste product. So as an outcome of this, the waste products are going to be carbon dioxide. And that is all of a sudden because we're now breathing a lot more. Because we're using oxygen, it's an endurance activity. The body's got time to use that oxygen to produce energy. But as a result, because we're breathing out more, we produce a lot of carbon dioxide and also water, which is what we're losing through sweat. So we can use this for any kind of long duration activity. And that can be low to moderate intensity. So we're only realistically training up to about 60% max effort. So naturally you think, well, marathon run, like surely everyone goes out there and they're putting 100% effort into it. And yes, they are to some extent, but they're only training at about 60% of their maximum intensity, because if they wanted to, they could put in more and they could sprint, but they're not going to be able to maintain that for a long period of time. So they have to drop that intensity down, find a pace they can maintain around 60% of their max effort. So this particular system is also very good for increasing cardiovascular fitness, as it's going to then improve the delivery of oxygen to the muscles. If we can improve delivery of oxygen to the muscles, we can produce more energy. So this one is now aerobic. So aerobic meaning with oxygen, anaerobic without. So I said I'd show you a mitochondria. So here is your mitochondria, your little cooking pot within the cell. So in goes your oxygen, in goes your fats, and in goes your carbohydrates. That's now going to produce a waste product, which is your carbon dioxide. But as a result, we now get your ATP out of that, but we will also lose water during sweat. So your aerobic system is good for activities such as long distance running, marathons, triathlons, long distance swimming, long distance cycling. Here is just an overall kind of summary. So what I'd like you to do is maybe just pause the screen, maybe take a screenshot, just make some notes on this one. But one thing I will show on this one is if we look towards the bottom, you can see the recovery time. So if we look at the creatine phosphate system, this has a quick recovery time. So anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. So think again, like this is good for your max intensity. So let's say something like a 100-meter sprint, world record is kind of just under 10 seconds. So somebody who has just started sprinting, they're looking to maybe compete in the next 6 months, it may take them around 5 minutes to fully recover and replenish before they can go back at 100% intensity. Someone like Usain Bolt may only need 30 seconds because he's conditioned for it. If you move over to the lactate system, this takes around 20 minutes to 2 hours to recover. And it's just to basically give the body enough time to break down that lactic acid, clear it out the body before you're ready to go again. And then if you look over to the aerobic system, it's theoretically, because we're using carbs, fats, and oxygen, it's just the time it takes us to eat and drink to replenish those fuel stores. And to give you just a quick visual here, you can see the blue is your creatine phosphate. So it gives us like loads of energy really quickly, but it crashes very quickly. Move over to your lactate. It's a steadier increase. It still gives us quite a lot of energy, but again, it burns off quite quick. But then you look at your aerobic, and it's a slow build up, and then theoretically we can maintain that as long as we are consuming the nutrients we need to supply that energy system to produce that phosphate. So I hope energy systems has made sense, and we should now be able to describe how carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are used in the production of the energy for adenosine triphosphate, and how the use of these 3 energy systems during aerobic and anaerobic exercise are